Welcome back everyone to our studies in AQA A-level history, the topic specifically being that of the British Empire. Now, the main textbook for the British Empire topic spent a very brief amount of time talking about the concept of informal empire right about now. And I wanted to just go through this idea of informal empire and expand on it in a bit more detail in this lesson. So, generally speaking, the concept of quote-unquote informal empire refers to a type of imperial dominance that was exercised by a nation over another without formal territorial control or direct political governance. So while this idea of informal empire was attempted to be regulated against by the Berlin Conference, because of course the Berlin Conference established this rule of effective occupation for African territories, by the 1890s, the British Empire had established quite significant informal influence across a number of different regions that are outside the area of Africa, so places like China and some parts of Latin America, as well as Iran. So I want to spend some time talking about this idea of informal empire and provide a couple of case studies concerning China, some parts of Latin America, as well as Iran, before thinking about some theoretical perspectives associated with this idea of informal empire. So that's essentially the definition of informal empire, this idea that while you're not actually there, you've not actually established effective occupation, you've not got this sort of empire in the traditional sense of, like, for example, the British control over India, for example, but you have quite a lot of control over the nation through a number of different means and methods. And generally speaking, it concerns things like economic dominance, the control over trade and finance and industry without directly governing these areas. It might also include the use of diplomatic influence, the use of treaties, for example, or concessions or extraterritorial rights to try and assert authority, and then the deployment of forces to protect economic interests and to maintain order, which I guess sort of formalizes the idea of informal empire, but at the very least maintains a sort of an arm's length distance away from this idea of empire proper with this idea of informal empire. Now, this is a type of imperialism that essentially allows Britain during this time to exert quite substantial influence over areas of the world that she had not officially colonized. And so it also was able to essentially, you sort of get the benefits of empire exerting substantial influence without any of the costs, namely the administrative costs or the complexities associated with formal colonization, the maintenance of law and order, the upholding of and stationing of troops and formal institutions. So where does this show? Where are the examples of informal empire that we can point to? Well, you could point theoretically to China for a start, through the unequal treaties and economic exploitation of China. So essentially, following the Opium Wars from 1839 to 1842, and then from 1856 to 1860, a sort of a period that's slightly before the study that we're doing here for this A-level, Britain would impose, after these conflicts took place, what were known as unequal treaties on China. Essentially, what these quote-unquote unequal treaties did was granted Britain extraterritorial rights, control over strategic areas like Shanghai, and also the establishment of a presence in places like Shanghai, like the establishment of the Shanghai Municipal Council, which operated independently from China, by the way. The opium trade then would be facilitated by British merchants and become a significant source of revenue, with estimates by the 1850s of accounting up to 20% of Britain's entire export or import revenue. And so fundamentally, these unequal treaties essentially gave Britain a lot of control, economic control, quite a lot of municipal control, as well as the extraterritorial rights, and they would benefit greatly from this without having to colonize China, without having to go through the process of colonizing. And so British naturalists as well as British nationalists, consular officials, for example. They operated freely within China. They conducted scientific research, they collected data. Institutions like, for example, the British Consular Service, the Chinese Maritime Customs, as well as the Protestant missionary organizations, all provided infrastructure for a lot of things concerning research and building networks of interstate commerce. This became, of course, a very significant part of research in China, but also would begin to allow for economic exploitation fundamentally. So at no point would we argue that Britain colonized China in the same way that Britain colonized parts of Africa, for example, or the subcontinent of India. But in other ways, they very much established quite significant control and benefited quite significantly from unequal treaties in China, leading to this idea of informal empire and informal imperialism. Further case studies take place with Britain's interests in Latin America, specifically Argentina, Uruguay, and Chile. In Argentina specifically, we can see that Britain played a pivotal role in investing in the nation's economic developments, such that by 1910, slightly after the period that we're studying here, British ownership accounts for approximately 66% of Argentina's railway system. We'll get to looking at this in lessons in the future in a few weeks' time, when we start talking about investing in empire in later chapters. But fundamentally, the investment in Argentina's railway system meant that Britain had a significant amount of control over it, and there was a few specific railways that we'll get to, like I said, in future lessons. This was all beneficial because it ultimately facilitated the export of agricultural products to European markets, benefiting Britain economically. This infrastructure was designed not for domestic transportation necessarily, but to export goods and to therefore reinforce economic influence. We also see as well that British capitalists controlled significant sectors of Argentina's industry and finance. They established a quite strong economic presence, again, trying to assert dominance and control without using the same kind of structures or mobilization of violence or power that you would see or you would expect with the sort of traditional understanding of imperialism that we get when we look, for example, at Africa or India. In Uruguay, a similar thing takes place. British influence was evidenced with things like the Treaty of Montevideo from 1828, which was a treaty that was mediated by Britain, and it established Uruguay as a buffer state between Brazil and Argentina. If you want to have a look at a map, have a look and see where Uruguay is in relation to Brazil and Argentina. What this did was essentially reflect Britain's strategic interest in maintaining regional stability in order to protect its economic interests. And then finally, in Chile, we can see that British merchants and financiers would be instrumental in maintaining, again, economic activities. They invested in various industries. They invested in mining and in agriculture. They facilitated trade between Chile and European markets, again, all allowing Britain to exert influence over Chile's economic policies and development. So if you get a question about informal empire, it would be quite a difficult question fundamentally. It's quite a niche part of the specification. But if you'd got a question about informal empire, then Latin America is one such case study that you could use. A final case study is that of Iran. In Iran, we can see that the British, again, utilizes this idea of informal empire to exert economic control to benefit her own interests. There is the establishment, for example, of the Imperial Bank of Persia in 1885, with a concession from the Persian government to Baron Julius de Ruyter, a German Jewish banker who would later become a British subject. This, again, is exemplifying Britain's economic dominance over this region. The bank controlled, or the bank introduced, should I say, European banking practices into Iran, and these banking practices would be operated under the basic principles of British law, despite being based in Tehran, of course, the capital of Iran. Now, it played a significant role in Iran's financial system, but it also benefited Britain because it was modelled on British banking practices and granted concessions from the Persian government to British subjects. We also see that British companies secure exclusive rights in key industries in Iran, such as the tobacco industry, which again further consolidates Britain's economic interests in Iran, and follows a very similar model that we saw when we looked at China and when we looked at Latin America, and now as we're looking at Iran, a very similar strategy takes place in Iran as all the others. From a theoretical perspective, then, we can see that there is this idea that is introduced by historians Ronald Robinson and John Gallagher. This idea is known as the imperialism of free trade thesis. This is this idea that Britain's expanding influence took place through economic dominance rather than necessarily through territorial acquisition. So they wielded this idea of informal empire as a way to expand its influence and to maintain its economic dominance. Britain's informal empire was as significant, according to this view, as its formal colonies, because it had substantial investments and economic activities that occurred outside of the formal empire and the formal imperialism that we're so used to studying. Historian John Darwin, for example, further emphasised that informal empire was an integral part of global strategy for the British, and this highlighted the adaptability and the use of economic and diplomatic tools to maintain the influence there. So, on some accounts then, informal empire, while it is a sort of a footnote in the specification, can be argued to have been one of, if not the most fundamental part of the British imperial strategy, even more important than that of the formal imperial structures that we see in Africa and in India and in such places like that.